This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. There comes a time in every legislative session when the clock starts to become a factor. With adjournment for the Louisiana legislature mandated for no later than 6 p.m. on June 8th, there is now less than a month and major decisions have to be made. The lawmakers might also be anxious to be campaigning for the statewide October 14th general election. For that, the clock has already started. 39 years ago, on this date, the gates were open to begin the Louisiana World's Fair, an event that was highly anticipated, but that will forever be the subject of good memories and critical analysis. We will look at these stories as well as a study on minimum wage in Louisiana, plus the condition of the city's public pools and the repercussions of a crime outside of a beloved restaurant. Joining us are tonight Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Jeremy Alford, editor and publisher, La Politics Weekly, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Tan Trung, news and digital team reporter, WWL Radio. We'll go over to Jeremy first for the latest on what's going on or not going on at the Louisiana legislature. The House did send a budget over to the Senate, and it did not have what the governor wanted in it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bare bones budget, really. The House sent a spending plan over that did not include teacher pay raises. The real travesty was the lack of funding for early childhood education. Seems like that's something everyone should be able to agree on. It also had a reduction in resources, healthcare resources for those who need it the most, the poorest among us, the sickest among us. You know, a lot of folks don't realize, but there's a spending cap. The state can't just spend as much money as it wants to every year. It's in the Constitution. There's a formula. And this happens to be a year where lawmakers have a lot of cash to spend, a lot of surplus, about $1.8 billion for the current fiscal year and the next. To spend that extra money, they have to bust the cap. That's what folks around the Capitol are saying. And that's a 2/3 vote in each chamber. And the lines are clearly drawn on this. On one side, you have the Senate. The Senate president has a resolution to spend the excess money on roads, bridges, coastal restoration work, retirement debt. The governor backs that plan. But over on the House side, you've got a lot of members who are digging in and saying, no, we want to save this money. We want to do the fiscally conservative thing while Republicans have a supermajority. And outside groups are starting to take sides. You've got the associations that represent the mayors and the parish presidents on the side of the Senate saying, look, if y'all bust the cap, that will help us provide basic government services. On the other side, next week, you're going to hear groups like Louisiana Association of Business and Industry, Builders and Contractors, Family Forum, Louisiana Committee for a Conservative Majority, all get behind another kind of version of this plan that's coming together that does not bust the cap, that calls for fully funding the rainy day fund. That's our state savings account. And also paying down retirement debt. And while on the surface that sounds like a good government agenda, a lot of folks don't realize a couple of years ago a law was passed that if all these things happen, it triggers reductions in the corporate franchise tax. Practically vanishes the corporate franchise tax, and there's a very small reduction in individual income taxes for folks like us at this table. Folks who are listening, it's not as big as what the corporate folks get, small, but a reduction nonetheless. So there's a lot of politics at play, and the question is, you know, will lawmakers pass a budget on time? They needed special sessions in the past. Yeah. The House and the Senate are going in opposite directions right now, so we'll have to see what kind of kumbaya moments they can create.
Jeremy, if taxes are reduced then, if all of these situations come together, as you explained, and according to that new law, if we do see these reduction in taxes, like the corporate franchise taxes, even the individual income tax rates, what does that do to future budgets for the state of Louisiana? We've got this surplus right now. Is that something that's really going to cause us a problem down the line if we don't have these taxes coming in?
I mean, look, if you have fewer taxes, you are going to have less tax revenue. That's an easy thing to figure out. But depending on who you ask, folks will tell you, look, we have this huge tax surplus because too much taxes are being collected. So do individuals deserve a little kickback this fiscal year? Do corporations? It looks like lawmakers are going to want to do that, especially with re-election right around the corner.
Yeah.
Well, and if the corporations get the break, does it make more corporations come in and therefore increase the taxes that we're generating? Isn't that the end game, maybe?
I think that's the argument you hear from lawmakers, but we've heard that argument for so many years now with these credits and these incentives, and I think everybody keeps waiting for us to move up in all these rankings, and it's just not happening.
So why do we have these surpluses right now?
Well, part of it is some folks might argue that the state is collecting too much in taxes, that's where the surplus comes from. But we've also had an embarrassment of riches from the federal government on both COVID and infrastructure spending.
Right.
that has been beneficial to the state, although that is federal money.
That is federal money, and that's not going to keep happening.
That's right.
And we're also going to lose a part of that sales tax, right? That's going to fall off.
So that's something you're going to start hearing more about is the fiscal cliff. And lawmakers are talking about this. In 2025, a 0.45% temporary state sales tax rolls off the books, and that's going to be less money for the state. It was always supposed to be temporary in nature. Anytime the state needs money in a quick and dirty way, they go through the sales tax. Right now, we're not in that pinch, but when it was created, the state was. And so there are ideas to try to gradually phase it out so it's not such of a big hit, but I don't know if there's going to be the appetite to do that this year in this session. Lawmakers are under no requirement to do that right now.
Okay, so this is a big issue that they're going to have to grapple with over the next 3 weeks. Meanwhile, will they be able to come out with a budget by the end of this session? Or?
There are many lawmakers who wonder if they will be able to pass a budget on time. Those same lawmakers know, though, that it's very risky to come back and try to do this in a special session during an election year. So I think everyone's going to kind of lean in the same direction and hope for the best.
Okay. We'll see. We'll be looking forward to hearing more from you about this in the weeks to come. All right, Jeremy, thanks a lot. Hey, over to you. World's Fair, 1984 World's Fair. It was a lot of fun, a lot of memories, but not really everything that it was hoped to be.
Well, we can start with the conclusion. The conclusion was that it was a financial failure. The locals loved it. And the 3 points, financial failure, locals loved it. It did leave some legacy for the future, though. Like, that was pretty much of an abandoned warehouse area, and that it redeveloped, like where Riverwalk is, the whole Riverwalk complex, and the convention center. It's all part of a legacy of the World's Fair, and so it really kind of reintroduced that part of the city to the public, but at a pretty great cost too. And so the financial failure part still resonates with it. What comes to mind is that there was a lot of anticipation for it a long time. It would be 1984, and by the 80s, you would do that. I remember getting press releases, and like from maybe 79 on, there'd be an announcement about a new building being built, and it says it's projected to be finished in time for the World's Fair in 1984. And so there was a lot of anticipation, but at the same time, there was a lot of nervousness that it wasn't going to do well. It didn't get the support from the federal government. It didn't get much support from the state or the city either. And so they all kind of at it on their own and doing the best they could. We came up with a decent fair that I think people liked. But there's one story that comes to mind, two media stories. One is on the day before the fair opened, that the fair officials had a media day. And they brought him around and they showed him around the fair site. And then at the end of the day, they had like a big meeting with Peter Spurning, who was the director. And you couldn't help notice, because I was there, that it didn't seem anywhere near to being complete. You know, they were still painting, they were still putting in the electricity, they were still installing things, and everybody was noticing that. And so they had this big meeting with Peter Spurning, and he says, look, don't go by what you saw today, but tomorrow we'll be ready, I promise. Well, there seemed like no way possible they'd be ready. I mean, it was probably like 5 o'clock in the afternoon the day before. And I remember walking out, and they had like a press conference room, or a media room, and I could hear these guys calling in their radio reports to various stations, to the networks, and they were saying, well, less than 24 hours before the World's Fair opens in New Orleans, it seems nowhere near being complete. And so that was the story that was going out that night. And when people were saying, the thoroughfare doesn't seem complete, I remember that day when it opened. This was when CNN was still doing its half-hour news every half hour. And they were starting all their newscasts with that. It was the same thing. On the opening day of the World's Fair, it seems nowhere near complete. Well, the fact is, anybody that was there said, hey, this looks pretty good. Miraculously, I don't know what happened, okay? It's like aliens came in or something overnight. But everything was painted. Everything was installed. Everything was working. I think the monorail had a breakdown for a while, but ultimately, it was a happy experience. But the idea had already been planted, and that plus the ideas of that they've been hearing. But there's one story.
Well, we got to move on soon, too. So you can
okay, well, it's a great story, though.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, but we have to move on to Tom
Okay.
right now. We're starting to go over. But, it was certainly, as we said, wasn't quite what we anticipated, but we still had a lot of fun in it, those of us who can remember the World's Fair. Tom, over to you. Now, a minimum wage, and that is sort of linked to the legislature also, because we're not seeing any sort of legislative action to raise the minimum wage in the state of Louisiana, which is just at the federal level, which ain't much.
Well, we haven't seen any legislative action, true legislative action since 2009. That was the last time the minimum wage was adjusted, and that was because the federal minimum wage was adjusted. Louisiana is one of 5 states in the country that doesn't have a law pertaining and mandating a minimum wage. So we're still sitting at $7.25 an hour. To be fair, many businesses and many employers have bumped their pay up. You probably have seen some of the advertisements for Raising Cane, so on and so forth.
Right.
They're advertising $18 an hour. But the state itself has not adjusted the minimum wage since 2009. So we're still sitting at $7.25 an hour. And just to bring people up to date, there was a push in the House. There were 2 identical bills, one in the House, one in the Senate. The House version died in committee. The Senate version passed committee, but it's probably unlikely. If history is any indicator of what's going to happen, it's unlikely that the legislature is going to move to improve or raise the minimum wage. And we're talking about just a few dollars. Initially it was going to be raised to $10 and eventually up to $14 by 2028. Now, the interesting thing is there's no index on that, meaning there's no adjustment for inflation in that. So, the plain arithmetic for me when I present this, this argument or, this idea of a minimum wage, are you doing better than you were 2 years ago in what you're making? And I think because of inflation, everybody across the board, regardless of your salary, can say no.
Just really, really feeling the pinch. So you did a long piece, a long interview, and we could find it where? WWL website, your podcast?
Yeah, the podcast is on every major podcast platform,
Okay.
Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, so on and so forth.
Because you talked to someone from Loyola University, is that right?
Yeah, Erica Zucker.
Who really shared a lot of insight into, how this impacts people.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you can't talk about the minimum wage without talking about poverty. And when you talk about poverty in Louisiana, we're vacillating between last and just second to last when it comes to poverty. And the joke has always been, thank God for Mississippi. But right now we're sitting as the second poorest state. And Erica Zucker, who is the director of policy over at the Workplace Justice Center at the Loyola Law Clinic, put a lot of things into perspective. According to Oxfam, and this was something that was very telling to me at least, more than almost 40%, we're talking about 39% of all workers in the state, and I'm not just talking about state workers, so on and so forth. Almost 40% of the workers in the state of Louisiana work for less than $15 an hour. And if we're talking about a minimum wage at $7.25, that's almost double the minimum wage that we're sitting at. So if most of us, are making less than $15 an hour, that doesn't say much for where we are as a state right now in terms of job growth and people getting out of that poverty rate. It's a very challenging time for people, and I think that most people in that lower sector, in the working poor class, would say we definitely need some help.
So the argument, for those legislators who say, no, we're not going to raise this, we don't think that we should tell business, that is their argument. What does business say?
I think they're saying the same thing. They would say that most businesses have already, and to be fair, most wages have gone up in Louisiana, but the median wage in Louisiana is right now annually is right around $51,000. Not a whole lot, and we're talking about a very poor state with a poor education system as well. And most of the working poor are on these government assistance programs, and you have, a certain sector of the government that says, these people need to move off of these government assistance programs. And most of the people would say, well, if you want us to move off the government assistance programs, you could do something about raising the wages. That would help greatly.
Okay, can municipalities raise the the minimum wage on their own, or is that not permitted in this state?
That's the odd thing, Marcia, is that while we don't have a minimum wage here, the state of Louisiana in 1997 actually passed a law that dictated to municipalities and smaller governments that they can't establish their own minimum wages because for the sake of uniformity, which is interesting because while they don't want to move on the minimum wage, they don't want anybody else in the state to move on the minimum wage or establish their own either.
Okay, so the issue is still there in the Senate, but
on paper it's still alive.
Yeah.
But again, if it hasn't moved since 2009, I don't see much reason for legislators at this point to move it on this year.
All right, thanks a lot, Don. Don, over to you. Nord pools, public pools in the city of New Orleans.
Public pools anywhere are paying great wages, if you want to talk about wages, because of a national lifeguard shortage. The shortage has a lot to do with COVID. Lifeguards typically are teenagers. I served as one when I was a teenager. It's a great summer job. It's fun, easy, you get trained, and you hang out outside all day. But nationally, 1/3 of the public pools were closed last summer. 1/3 of available public pools were shut down because there weren't enough lifeguards. In the city of New Orleans, only 7 of the public outdoor pools were able to open last summer. This summer, they're hoping that number will be 10. They're still in the hiring process. The city of New Orleans is paying $16.71 an hour for certified lifeguards, and you do have to be certified to work at a pool. Nationally, the Red Cross usually administers lifeguard certification, and the age is 16. In some cases in New Orleans, they've been able to get it lowered to 15 with a work permit. And the city of New Orleans is doing something really interesting this summer, actually. They've adopted a junior lifeguard program for kids who are 13 to 15 years old. And in that program, it's actually a paid internship program. You get your lifeguard training. You actually go learn how to work at a pool. Once you're 15, if you've done well, you can be hired on at that $16.71 wage. And it's not, you talk about pools in summer and leisure activity. Swimming is the only sport where you actually can save your life by knowing how to do it. So it's really a very critical skill to learn. And COVID forced all the pools to be closed and a lot of kids to miss that crucial window when they should have learned to swim. Nationally, drowning is the second leading cause of death by injury in children. So it's not just go out and get your tan on and have a good time at the pool. It really is critical that you can learn to swim and that the pools be open. For the Nord facilities, at least, they are attempting to be open from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. 7 days a week. Last summer, they had to kind of rotate the schedule around the various pools just so they could have adequate coverage. So maybe one pool's open Monday, Wednesday, Friday, another pool is open Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, but they are trying to make sure a pool in every community is open several days a week so that people can get out there to cool off and also learn how to swim through swimming programs there. I'm reminded you do not have to be a teenager to be a lifeguard. Anybody who knows how to swim can go ahead and get lifeguard training. Teachers who are off in the summer, it's a good wage and it's flexible hours and all that, and nationwide, people are looking for lifeguards. In the city of Phoenix, for instance, they're paying $3,000 bonuses to people who make it through the whole summer as a lifeguard just because they're so short-staffed. So if you've got the spare time, go ahead and get the lifeguard training and get the pool open.
Hey, did you have a question?
Yeah, a lot of those pools were closed after the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. But gradually they reopened, especially under Moon Landrieu, who was very sympathetic to all that. And so they opened, they got a lot of federal money involved in that. It was very impressive because, and I was working as a volunteer during that time out of college, and they had a lot of Red Cross lifeguards. And these are mostly Central City kids that are there. So a lot of them were getting that kind of lessons and learning about, we had a lot of kids who were learning about swimming at the time. It was a very healthy thing. So many kids was almost a danger because on big holidays, the pool was just packed with people and we had to keep a close eye on everything. But it was a good example of that period in trying to get out of the hole that things had been and get this activity going again.
And so when do they open?
They open June 3rd. June 3rd, which is the first Saturday in June.
Okay.
That's their historic opening because they're city employees, so they don't open on the holiday of
Okay.
Memorial Day, but they will be open this year on July 4th.
And so I don't know if you know this, but does someone have to be a New Orleans resident in order
You
to?
do to use the
Okay.
Nord pools.
Okie doke. All right. Thanks a lot, Dawn. All right, E, we're going to stick with you because, boy, we were all just horrified at what happened outside of Mandina's at, the first night of Jazz Fest.
Yeah, well, so, there's been a lot of murders, unfortunately, during that period, and all of them is, no one outranks the other in terms of the
Right.
horror and everything else. This one gets a little bit more attention because being outside Mantina's, it's such a well-known place. It's so much a part of people's life and such a visual thing. It's a place for escape, for joy more than anything else. But what happened on that Friday, what we know is that a waiter who apparently was a really popular waiter, he'd been working there like since he was 12 and then worked his way up to waiter. They have outside table service there. He was walking to bring some food and somebody shot him in the back. And then they took off. Apparently, according to most reports, there were two people involved. Haven't heard much about the second person. A security guard fired at one of them. Apparently, didn't hit anybody, and I don't know what a bullet in, and so we don't know much about that. I think what was a really important point, though, and I give the interim police chief some credit, is almost immediately these news reports were going out, because this was that Friday night of the Jazz Fest, and they were going out on the national news by the time that the person has been murdered, near the New Orleans Jazz Fest. And so quickly it was associating the Jazz Fest with this murder. And Chief Woodfork the next day said, look, this had nothing to do with the Jazz Fest. It was a targeted murder rather than a random murder. In its own way, targeted is a little bit more assuring because it means you're more likely to be a victim of random murder than the target one. The police did some pretty quick work and arrested one of them, someone's accused who's in Houston. We don't know about the rest of it. But I'll just say this, it brings to mind, after Katrina, that restaurant reopening was a real sign of improvement at your neighborhood coming back. It was a really important moment when Mandina's came back after Katrina. And by this time, Mandina's was back in action that Monday. And supposedly Mayor Cantrell was there too. So there was a whole effort out there to kind of support it and bring it back.
I saw him interviewed, and so many people showed up to be there to support Mandina's because it was just heartbreaking to see what happened there. And also we should note that there was a customer who was also shot from one of the bullets that randomly flew in.
Yeah, and the customer who was shot, she was there partly to celebrate a birthday for a friend from Chicago who was a radio host. And so this was all over Chicago news. Not that we have much to be embarrassed with when Chicago, we talk about crime, but anyway, it became a big story.
Okay, all right, Ed, thanks a lot. Jerry, we're going over to you just to wrap up now, because we're in election, so what's the latest on?
I mean, the most notable trend to me right now are the number of candidates and committees in the governor's race that are already on TV. And look, it's not unusual to see a candidate go up early. 8 years ago, last open race for governor, Scott Angel, former lieutenant governor, was on TV in February. This time around, though, you got a lot of folks up on TV, and usually they wait until Labor Day, late summer. Governor John Bel Edwards last cycle waited till late July to start his media buy. But so far, Treasurer John Schroeder's been on TV. He was the first candidate, and he just added $1 million to his media buy this week. He also announced that all of his fundraising money moving forward all going into TV, 100%. Jeff Landry, Attorney General, followed him up on TV soon after. He's on TV statewide, but something really interesting, he has a crime spot that he's rolling out each week by region, and it's different, it's tailored to that audience. In New Orleans, he took a swipe at LaToya Cantrell. In Shreveport, he's taking a swipe at the DA. Also, there's a super PAC already up on TV. It's a pro-Stephen Wagasback PAC. And Hunter Lundy, independent from Lake Charles, is up on radio, and he'll be on TV within the next 3 weeks, probably.
And former President Trump endorsed.
Former President Trump endorsed Jeff Landry. But the question is why? Why is everybody trying to get up on TV early? And the simple answer is that Jeff Landry's name recognition is just that high, and everyone else has to build, and they need to start now. Can they stay up on TV until Election Day? That's a lot of cash. John Bel Edwards bought in July last cycle, stayed up the whole time. That was like $19 million. I mean, nobody's got that money.
Well, that brings us to the question: what's the fundraising like for everybody? Like John Schroeder's, you say he's got $1 million buy. What's
like? No one's coming anywhere close to the sophisticated fundraising operation that Jeff Landry has, and it's everyone's just doing their best and trying to have a few million cash on hand by August.
E, did you have No, I thought
no,
you had a
good.
question in there. So John Schroeder, yeah, I mean, he had to get his name out there because he's just not that familiar, certainly. I mean, the people are not that familiar with him, although he is a statewide elected official. And so he got out there making that gumbo, and, and we saw that spot a whole lot.
Yeah.
A whole lot.
And we're about to see even more. It's interesting to see him committing to dedicating all of that money to media moving forward, but he says he has his basic expenses covered, and it certainly addresses any rumors that might be out there about him dropping out.
And Marcia, just going back even further before, former President Trump's endorsement of Landry,
Yeah.
It's notable to kind of point out that the Republican Party in Louisiana endorsed Landry early on as well,
Right.
to kind of just clear the field and establish that position for him as well.
And who else is running now? Sharon Hewitt, right?
So Treasurer John Schroeder is among the Republicans, with Jeff Landry, State Senator Sharon Hewitt, State Representative Richard Nelson is running as well, and Stephen Wagensback, former president of Louisiana Association of Business and Industry. On the Democratic side, the lone marketable candidate remains former Transportation Secretary Sean Wilson, and then the independent in the race is Hunter Lundy. He's a trial attorney from Lake Charles.
And qualifying?
In August.
All right, Jeremy, thanks a lot. Other stories, E, over to you.
Well, the big killer news this past week was that Hubig's Pie is bringing back the chocolate pie, what it used to do. Supposedly there are some samples out on the market that people have spotted, but pretty soon they'll be doing a full run of it. So chocolate Hubig's Pie is coming by. So we're not probably too far from chocolate Hubig's Pies in Sazerac as being a New Orleans feast. So.
Oh, this sounds yummy. All right, Jeremy, over to you.
The Senate starts to chip away at the budget question in earnest next week.
Well, that's a complex one. So when do you think? Do you think it's possible for them to really come to an agreement? Or
I think
will
they
the
could.
special session
They have
be
until June
necessary?
8th. They have until June 8th, and they have passed solutions at the last minute. I'm sure they can do it again.
All righty, Don, over to you.
One of the pools that is supposed to reopen this summer is the Whitney Young pool uptown in the zoo parking lot that didn't get to open all summer last year because of a major pipe burst underneath of it. It is also on the schedule to open June 3rd, the rest of them. So
All right.
all the neighborhoods should have pools covered this summer.
Pools are needed in the summer, that's for
Well,
sure.
especially when it will be 90 this week.
Yeah, okay. It's feeling it already. Don, over to you.
I think there's going to be some media attention paid, and the city council, the vice president of the city council in New Orleans, is already drawing attention to it, that these deadly shootings, particularly of women, we've seen some horrific shootings of mothers. We just had 2 overnight. Helena Moreno has brought attention to that, and I think that going forward, there's probably going to be more kind of discussion about what is happening within the city, that women are being targeted more, and there's a higher percentage of women that are becoming victims of these deadly shootings.
All righty, Don, thank you. Thank you guys for being here, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources, and happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. We'll see you next week. Have a good evening.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.